The promise of the Kennedy administration ended with his assassination. Since then, we've learned a lot about his darker side, including the political enemies and allies who really hated him. A lot. If you think the person who despised John F. Kennedy the most in the 1960 presidential race was Richard Nixon, that'd be a nope. Wrong side of the ticket. Turns out that LBJ hated JFK. Now, it's no secret that Lyndon Baines Johnson clashed with Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. That makes sense, given that RFK was his brother's chief lieutenant, a job that should have gone to the VP, and Johnson, as an alpha male and Texan, didn't like being brushed aside. Word around Washington was that he despised having to serve as vice president at all, like he was above it. Jackie Kennedy had a pleasant relationship with the Johnsons, but she later outed Jack's real feelings about Lyndon and Lady Bird. Apparently, Kennedy didn't think Johnson was contributing anything to the administration, and he even doubted his fitness to be president. Jack felt so strongly about it that in the months before the assassination, he talked with Bobby about ways to prevent Johnson from becoming the Democratic nominee in '68. So at least the feeling was mutual. Johnson thought the Kennedy brothers were snobby coastal elites, and he seemed to resent living in Kennedy's shadow even after the assassination. Apparently, the phrase, "Kennedy wouldn't have done that," followed Johnson for the rest of his life, to the point where he was recorded complaining about it long after the presidency was behind him. Kennedy wasn't crazy about Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the feeling was mutual. It wasn't so much their 27-year age difference as it was a clash of personality, at least on Kennedy's part. You see, Jack found the old general to be cold. Eisenhower, on the other hand, didn't like the idea of a young, inexperienced Jack Kennedy replacing him in the most powerful office in the world.
Kennedy, he thought, was just a junior senator from Massachusetts who was a novice, who knew nothing about the world at large.
There was also the part where he disagreed with nearly every major decision Kennedy made while president. But as a military man, Eisenhower understood the chain of command. Therefore, his lack of confidence in his successor reinforced his determination not to undermine Kennedy publicly and to offer support and advice where and when he could. In fact, Eisenhower was among those Kennedy consulted during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 years after the Kennedy assassination, the general saw a poll in which American historians were asked to rate the presidents. He resented what he perceived as an attempt to establish the late president as a seminal figure in American history by what he called the Kennedy cult. If Ike knew how bad those rankings got today, he'd be spinning in his grave. Throughout his life, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev insisted that he both liked and respected Jack Kennedy. The two met in 1959 when Kennedy was in the Senate, and Khrushchev was reportedly impressed. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to run roughshod over him one-on-one. He aimed to embarrass America during their 1961 Vienna summit, and truthfully, he probably did. He generally threw Kennedy for a loop with his brazen requests, like taking all of Berlin and putting it under East Germany's control. In the immediate aftermath of the meeting, Khrushchev allegedly boasted that Kennedy was spineless and incapable of facing a Soviet challenge, and Kennedy didn't entirely disagree. He admitted to his aides and even to the American press, off the record of course, that he'd been well and thoroughly had. But when it came time to write his memoir, Khrushchev Remembers, the Soviet premier glossed over this encounter, preferring to write about his fondness for Kennedy and his preference for Kennedy over Nixon or Dwight Eisenhower. He called Kennedy's death a great loss that damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. J. Edgar Hoover hated Jack Kennedy. That's it. We can move on to the next subject. All right, fine. Here's a bit more context. Even though Hoover and Joe Sr. respected each other, it didn't stop Hoover from collecting a file of compromising information on Jack. The crazy part is he started collecting dirt on Kennedy's affairs as early as 1942. When Kennedy became president, Hoover could barely hide his disdain for his philandering and wasn't too fond of the new president's politics either. The bad blood between Hoover and the Kennedy brothers was mutual. While JFK maintained a public show of respect toward Hoover, he neither liked nor trusted him. For obvious reasons, he had concern over his vast surveillance network. Kennedy reportedly wanted to fire Hoover, so it came as a surprise when just one day after his election in 1960, he announced that Hoover would stay on. This more than likely had to do with the leverage Hoover had collected on him over the years. Kennedy enjoyed getting little doses of revenge by barging in on Hoover when he was napping, or taking him to lunch at working-class diners instead of the fancy DC joints Hoover preferred. But as much as Jack disliked Edgar, the real tension was between Hoover and Bobby, who feared Hoover's power, opposed it when he could, and deeply resented his political machinations. If anyone has a reason to be ticked off at JFK, it's Sam Giancana, at least if you believe the Chicago outfit stole Illinois and therefore the 1960 election for Kennedy as part of a deal with his father.
You tell us whether if you have opposition from anybody that you dispose of them by having them stuffed in a trunk. Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana?
It didn't get that far. Well, unless you're all in on that Oswald theory. Since conspiracies are fun, let's lay it out again for you. RFK brought down heat on the mafia, and after all they did to get JFK elected, the nerves of him. So bosses Carlos Barcelo and Santo Trafficante went to Sam Giancana for help. The mobster and the president did have one thing in common: a mistress.
I can, at this time, emphatically state that my relationship with Jack Kennedy was of a close personal nature.
Her name was Judith Campbell Exner, and she later claimed Giancana bragged about putting Kennedy into the White House. One associate even claimed that Giancana confessed to arranging the president's assassination. Throughout his presidency, Kennedy faced significant opposition from within his own party. The Dixiecrats were a group of Southern Democratic politicians who were hostile to the Kennedy civil rights agenda. Chief among the Dixiecrats was Alabama Governor George Wallace, who in his 1963 inaugural address famously declared,
"Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever."
He was so violently opposed to admitting black students to the University of Alabama that he threatened to defy federal court orders and swore there would be rioting if that were to happen. The stand in the schoolhouse door is best remembered for the scene in Forrest Gump, but it really happened. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy intervened, and thanks to his efforts, the university was successfully integrated without violence, and Wallace-sanctioned chaos in the South was narrowly averted. Needless to say, at the time, George Wallace hated all the Kennedys. JFK followed up this achievement with a speech to the nation in which he announced his intention to pass a civil rights bill.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
In an often forgotten twist, Wallace denounced his segregationist views and worked to educate those who thought as he once did. George Wallace wasn't the only Dixiecrat to come into conflict with Kennedy over civil rights. 47 years South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond became infamous for staging a 24-hour-plus filibuster to prevent the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. It was a failure, and the bill was passed 2 hours after he finally stopped talking. Thurmond kept pretty much mum about race back in the 1940s when he was governor of South Carolina, but by the time he reached the Senate, he was a full-throated racist. He detested Kennedy's civil rights bill and seemed to despise Kennedy himself so much it made him half crazy. For example, Thurmond insisted JFK was planning to surrender the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal to the United Nations. This was such an outrageous conspiracy theory that even newspapers that circulated in his home state of South Carolina went after him. In another odd twist, Thurmond also had a change of heart, and after flipping political parties in 1964, later became the first senator from a deep South state to hire an African American to his staff. You'd be remiss to not give him a little credit to the changes Kennedy made to the overall attitude of the country with his policies. You might think the people we already mentioned hated JFK, but they've got nothing on Bertrand Russell. Here's how he described Kennedy. Much more wicked than Hitler, they are the wickedest people who ever lived in the history of man, and it is our duty to do what we can against them. So who in the blazes is Bertrand Russell? Well, he was a British philosopher and mathematician, a socialist, and really liked inserting himself into world problems. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russell sent telegrams to both Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Notably, Russell didn't criticize Russian policy regarding Cuba in his message to Khrushchev, but did reprimand Kennedy for America's blockade. He was a socialist, so at least that's on point. Russell rushed Khrushchev's conciliatory reply to Kennedy, who didn't appreciate Russell involving himself in an international crisis. When the crisis passed, Russell expressed regret for not taking a gentler tone with Kennedy, but he still thought JFK messed up during the crisis. In yet another twist, third in a row, after Kennedy's assassination, Russell weighed in, criticizing the makeup of the Warren Commission and its handling of the evidence. In short, he likened Oswald to the Dreyfus affair from 1800s France. In other words, he thought Oswald was a patsy.